So here we are with our Norse Myths series, and today we're talking about myth number 4 in Kevin Crossley-Holland's The Norse Myths, The Lord of the Gallows. And as part of this, I will also be referring to this version of the Hávamál, Jackson Crawford's The Wanderer's Hávamál, which includes Old Norse sourced directly from the Codex Regius. Crawford's translation is very good. It is very culturally astute, which is why I like it. And I'm not going to talk any about like the Old Norse or anything of that. I kind of want to I don't know if we feel like we want to come and refer to some stanzas, then we can. There are some that I kind of want to refer to because I feel like they've been very simplified in the Kevin Crossley-Holland version. Like, I kind of wish that he would not, I'll start here. I wish he would not have turned this into a single simplified myth. I kind of wish he would have omitted this from this book, because the Hávamál is a distinct work. There's no guarantee that we don't know where it comes from. We don't know if it was composed by one person or many people. We don't know if these stanzas were transmitted orally for a time before being codified into poetry. We don't know if they were originally written down as poetry. We don't know if they were influenced by the Jesus story. The similarities between this story and the gospel are part of what makes it so significant for me. Because this is one of the only examples where Odin is not acting as violent war god and being deceptive and being subversive. This is one of the only times that we see Odin being very genuine. The text of the Hávamál is him really laying it out straight in his advice to Lord Fafnir, in his recounting of how he obtained the meat of poetry, in it's basically his confession, right? The Hávamál is Odin's confession, Odin's testament. And the nature of it being testament is what really tells me maybe the people writing this down were lightly influenced by Christian writing. So I'll start just with the notes. The notes for 4 are on 186. There is oh my gosh, I had like this really I had something I wanted to bring up here. Oh, yes. Odin learned 18 runes, which gave him, among other things, the power to heal, to blunt or break mana, etc., etc., etc. He didn't learn like what he learned was not runes. It is, let's see, I know magic spells that no woman knows, and no man either. The first is called help. So I think that the first mistake that Crossley-Holland makes is saying, oh, the spells are the runes themselves.
Well,
And it's like, no.
He does say on page 16, second paragraph, no one came to comfort me with bread. No one revived me with a drink from a horn. I peered at the worlds below. I seized the runes.
Yes.
Shrieking, I seized them. then I fell back. And then he begins discussing charms, which are entirely different things.
So here from Crawford, starting stanza 139. No one gave me food, no one gave me drink. At the end I peered down, I took the runes, screaming I took them, and then I fell. I learned 9 spells. Fimbul are mighty songs in Old Norse. I learned 9 mighty songs from the famous son of Bolthor, the father of Besla. He's right. Crossley-Holland is assuming that this means that this is referring to his uncle,
Mm-hmm.
but he's making a big assumption
Right.
because it's not actually clear from the Norse if it means the son of Bolthor, who is the son of Bolthor, where Bolthor is the father of Besla, or the son of Bolthor, where the son of Bolthor is the father of Besla.
Mhm.
It's not clear if Odin is learning these from his uncle or his grandfather, and if Bolthor is the great grandfather or the grandfather of Odin. All we know is that Besla is his mother. So there's assumption number 1 from Kevin. Jumping down to stanza 142, you will find runes, runic letters to read, very great runes, very powerful runes, which Odin painted, and which the holy gods made, and which Odin carved. This is one of those strange instances where the gods are referring to gods of their own.
Mm-hmm.
Odin carved for the gods, and Dain for the elves, Dvalin for the dwarves, and Osvid for the giants. I carved some myself. Do you know how to read them, write them, read them, paint them, test them, ask them, bless them, send them, offer them? Stanza 145, it is better not to pray at all than to pray for too much. Nothing will be given that you don't repay. It is better to sacrifice nothing than to offer too much. Odin carved this before the birth of humankind when he rose up and returned again. Now, this stanza 145, which occurs in the middle of this sequence of stanzas, is the last line of Kevin's retelling, right? These are the words of Odin before there were men and whatever. Still, it's not, it's the words being referred to is this stanza, not the whole tale. So then 146. So here's I got the runes by sacrificing myself to myself. Separate story. I learned 9 magic songs from my uncle or my grandfather. It's unclear which. And then jumping down stanza 146, I know magic spells. Yod Ekthokan. I know I can sing Ekthokan. I can sing Yod, spells, songs. Again, more songs. I know magic spells that no woman knows, and no man either. The first is called help. And then I know a second spell, I know a third spell, I know a fourth spell.
Mm-hmm.
There's no identity here between the spells and the runes. It's presumed that learning writing is what allowed Odin to learn the spells.
Yeah, and I'm agreeing with you now after double checking to see that Elder and Younger Futhark how many characters those have, and neither of them have 18. So I think he's equating runes with signs. And so when he discusses help as an example, I found the wording that he chose to be kind of evocative of, to me, of the written word for help or a symbol for help. And it made me think about how these charms, or his interpretation of the charms in his translation, they come across as more mundane. in the sense of anyone can write help on a wall and evoke from that a response, which Kevin
Mhm.
Crossley-Holland is making magical in his retelling, as if you do A, then B happens, magic. Like, it doesn't have the same kind of feeling to me that other translations would have had. I don't know, like it felt strange.
Definitely. I mean, and going into the Futhark, we don't have any, like, there is no rune that means help,
Mhm.
right? You would need to write out that word or aid, or I mean, you could write Naudis need,
Mhm.
right? But there's no clear drawing between these. Now, the person that wrote this down, I do want to go and look at just Hávamál, is presented as a single poem in the Codex Regius. The poem itself, a combination of numerous shorter poems, is largely gnomic, presenting advice for living, etc., etc. The textual history, the only surviving source is the Codex Regius. The part dealing with ethical conduct um, was traditionally identified as the oldest portion of the poem by scholarship in the 19th and early 20th century. Bellows identifies as the core of the poem a collection of proverbs and wise counsels, which dates to a very early time, but which, by the nature of oral tradition, had never had a fixed form or extent. Klaus von See identifies direct influence of the Distika Catonis on the Gestatheater, suggesting that also this part is a product of the high medieval period, and casting doubt on the unadulterated Germanic character of the poem claimed by earlier commentators. The gnomic core of the poem, other fragments and poems dealing with wisdom and proverbs accreted over time. A discussion of authorship or date for the individual parts would be futile, since almost every line or stanza could have been added, altered, or removed at will at any time before the poem was written down in the 13th century, the 1200s. Individual verses or stanzas nevertheless certainly date to as early as the 10th or even the 9th century. But we're saying so the earliest date is the 9th century for the writing down of these poems, which means that we're well beyond the attested use of any runes for actual writing, like well beyond. We're into a time when the runes would have been ascribed some magical or mystical nature, where our attested use of them is always for productive writing. We have no examples of, and by productive writing, I mean writing like what you're talking about, like writing out the word help. Okay. Like we have absolutely no example, no archaeological artifact that tells us that, or where we have single runes acting as charms or wards on shields, houses, graves, nothing. There are staves. Staves have writing on them. This is the king so and so. They have charms. They have, may this blah 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 be protected by so and so. But this is the same. This is Germanic, right? Even today, traveling through northern Germany, when you look at these Fachwerkhäuser, those had the houses with the wood beams and the bricks in between and filled in by the muck. The wood beam at the top of the house will be inscribed with like Bible verses, or by like not even Bible verses, but invocations to God to protect this house.
Mhm.
That's the kind of use I imagine,
Right.
right, for these runes. So I think that, yeah, we do take that Crossley-Holland is kind of falling prey to this. Not falling prey, again, just imposing his own fucking opinion, his own what he wants this to be
Mhm.
on the story. And this kind of it's starting to, like, as you get further in, you'll start to see like I feel like he gets more fair, but also more takes more creative freedom the further into these stories we go. Um, at this point, you really start to see that like he not only considers this a faithful representation of the myth, but his own interpretation of it, right? And it's very clear that like it was never this book is not intended to be translations. They're not translations. They're compilations. And it's definitely Kevin's like, this is what I think this story should be,
It's
right?
his
And
own
how it
retelling.
should be representative. Yeah.
To speak on his take, it's not entirely his own, I want to say, because this thinking of investing practical written language with a magical quality is not new. And we can, even like as theologians, we can think about how by writing things down, we change the world around us. By saying things, we change the world around us. And the weight of a spoken word versus a written word is also very different. Because someone might go about their day, maybe the beach is dangerous. A stranger comes up to them, tells them the beach is dangerous, don't go there for XYZ reason. This person's a stranger to you. You don't believe what they say. Their words have no value, no effect over you. You continue to go. You find a sign. It has the seal of a particular government. Now it's believable to you. The words have affected you. They've changed your reality. And this isn't to say whether or not the words themselves change reality in its entirety, but for your experience of that world, it has changed. And that can also be applied to just like discussions of or written books on philosophy or theology, the effects of those words and what they do to change your mind and how you perceive the world around you. This is especially impactful when we talk about like observational languages and how we use science to explain the world around us and use written text for that to explain this is how the world works. And we make it that way by believing in that, and it changes us. But that's a bit of an aside that I just thought was very interesting and important to just touch on. And I think that anyone listening to this after the fact might be interested to pursue that train of thinking and go about their own reading. But was there anything else that you wanted to point out?
I mean, yeah, well, just to bring it back to like, and I say, I mean, maybe we should take maybe 10 more minutes for this.
Yeah.
Um, the story,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how I kind of want to take this opportunity to talk about the personal significance of this story for me. The concept of sacrificing oneself to oneself is not foreign to me. It's not difficult for me to understand. It's not nebulous. It's not mysterious. It doesn't evoke any questions of why would you? It was very much a part of my reality at one point in my life. And the nature of that not being ritualistic, but a means to an end, is also not foreign to me. And there was a point where I was drinking enough where I couldn't eat. And I was kind of stuck between this rock and a rock and a hard place. I wanted to quit drinking in the sense that I wanted to not feel as bad as I did. I wanted to not starve. I wanted to enjoy food. I wanted to be able to sleep without waking up several times in sweaty sheets. I wanted to be able to go to sleep without having to drink myself to sleep. But I did not want to quit drinking. I wanted to be able to continue to drink alcohol, and I wanted to continue to be drunk. That's what it was. I wanted the effects of being drunk all the time to go away, but I did not want to stop being drunk all the time. I wanted to continue to drown out the pain that I was in, the spiritual anguish. And so the image of Odin hanging on the tree for 9 days is, I can imagine what that feels like. I can imagine it because I know what it was like to hang myself on a tree and force myself through this anguish. And it got to the point where, I never wanted to kill myself, but I definitely wanted to die. And in a metaphorical sense, I feel as if I was ready to, I was essentially sacrificing myself to myself. I was using myself as a sacrifice. I was sacrificing my own well-being in order to continue to be me, to be drunk me, to exist in the only way, that's how I want to say this, to exist in the only way that I knew how to exist, which was just in a stupor. And there was a point where I spoke my truth. It was in the context of an AA meeting. And I want to be really clear that this is not an advertisement for how AA works. It doesn't. Okay. You can make AA work for you. You can find a community of people that will help you recover if you are willing to do the work. And if you have the will and the ability to open a spiritual channel. But I don't want there to be any confusion on the part of any listener to this recording at any point in the future, or anyone here, that it was, I don't believe that it was the meeting that caused this, or the setting. The meeting provided me the opportunity for the very first time in my whole drinking career to admit that I was a slave to alcohol, to admit that that was not the life I wanted for myself. And that I had Stockholm syndrome, which I think it's ironic to speak of a syndrome named for a Swedish place in the context of Norse mythology. But that I had a Stockholm syndrome for alcohol, that I was in love with my captor, and that this is what attracted this god to me. And in no uncertain terms, with no intent at all to actually stop drinking that night, I did. And it wasn't a choice. It wasn't something that was hard. It wasn't something that I had to drag myself through or force myself to do. After I spoke this truth into the world, the need for me to drink was removed. And I used that exact terminology, and I will expand on it. It was surgically exacted from my soul, to the point where I felt it missing. I missed the desire to drink, but I did not have it. I did not have a craving. I didn't have it. going through the withdrawals, and I very dangerously went through cold turkey withdrawals off of very heavy alcohol use. I mean, do not do this. Don't do that. It'll kill you. I was lucky that I was able to survive it. Um, I went through these withdrawals rife with intense physical pain, hallucinations. You don't imagine how much you can sweat until you go through something like this. Becoming dehydrated from all of the sweating that I did. It going through that felt like it was not just necessary, it was the only way. It was that there was no longer another option. I never wanted, and I want to be really clear, like, to set the physical setting around this. I was on a couch where behind me was a whole cabinet full of liquor. Whiskey, gin, rum, what have you. It was all right there, 5 feet away from me. It was never an option. I never once had the desire to just go and take a drink to make it stop. And that's how I know, right? Because I wasn't in a rehab. I wasn't in a detox. I wasn't in a sober living. I was on the couch in a stranger's house completely by myself with a liquor cabinet right there. And I did not have the inkling to go and take a drink. Is how I know that a God acted in my life that night. And it took a long time for me to realize that it was this one. And when I read this story in the Hávamál, when I read these stanzas, it became very clear to me that this is why he picked me. This is why he came to me. Because after so long, so many years of being manipulative and subversive, of being at war, I chose to speak my truth and give my testament. And that I finally truly made the sacrifice of myself to myself. Now, Kagan, I've talked to you about this before, and I'm now in this retelling of my story revising because I've come to a new realization, right? I talked about thinking that he came to me because he saw me sacrificing myself to myself as a drunk, being ready to die, hoping that I would just finally drink enough that I would not wake up the next morning. But I think the sacrifice I really made was to walk into that room and speak my truth. That I was finally ready. Like I said, I wanted to keep being drunk. And I chose to sacrifice that in order to gain this mystical wisdom that would allow me to live a better life, to protect myself, to move forward into the future and be able to help other people. When we go back into these stanzas, let's look at these spells. The first is called Help. It will help you in lawsuits and sadness and all kinds of worries. I know a second spell which men need if they want to heal others. I'll take this like one by one. I had totaled my car. I had gotten a DUI. I was in a legal situation. Jackson Crawford's translation of Sutum, there's this oak, the Norse here, hjálp heter it, and thought that help amon vi so cum sorgum sucum jorfolum. Sutum is lawsuits. So it's specifically with legal troubles. I know a second spell which men need if they want to heal others. A big part of my new motivation for living is to be able to help other addicts. I know a third spell. If I have a great need to thwart my enemies, I dull the edges of their weapons and none of their blades will bite. Um, I want to, I'll note this and we'll go through the rest of the spells, but I can already say none of them are aggressive. None of them give you the ability to harm others. This third spell gives you the ability to prevent others from harming you. If chains and locks are placed upon my limbs, I cast this spell so I can escape. The chains burst from my hands, the locks burst from my feet. If I see a spear cast into a crowd of battling foes, it cannot fly so fast that I can't stop its flight, right? Another protective spell. If a man carves a curse against me, I call this spell down upon that man and his curse harms him instead of me. This is the closest it gets to harming another person, but it's not you that's taking the action. If I see a great flame consuming a hall full of people, it cannot burn so bright I cannot save those inside. I know an eighth spell, when hate arises between any two people, I can cool their tempers. I find it interesting that this really invokes the qualities of his wife, Frigga.
Mhm.
I know a ninth spell, if the need arises for me to save a ship upon the sea, I can calm the wind and upon the waves and soothe the sea to sleep. I know a tenth, if I see witches at play in the air, I can cast this spell so that they get lost, so they can't find their skins, so they can't find their minds. I find this very eerie. I know an 11th, if I lead old friends into a battle, I enchant their shields so that they will have the victory, that they will go to battle unharmed and return from the battle unharmed, that they will come home without harm. I know a 12th, if I see hanging from a tree a dead man's corpse, and so on and so on and so on. There is no one of these spells that involves aggression. And I feel that even though Odin is, for lack of a better word, my patron god, um, he supports me in living a life of peace. So, and in walking the third way, which we can talk about at another time.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that just, this story is pretty straightforward. Um, but that's why it has such a great personal significance for me.
Yeah, that is important. And I want to talk about that shamanic journey of sacrificing oneself to oneself. And you could also equate that night dealing with those withdrawals to that hanging.
It was 3 days, but yeah. Yes.
You described the one night.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, it's it's the same as Odin hanging there from that tree for X number of days. And I want to highlight that this dying and coming back in this shamanic journey, and with that coming back, bringing with you this new wisdom, you can think of sacrificing yourself to yourself in a way of what are you sacrificing. Like when you're looking at yourself, you have the image of you as an alcoholic and the image of you as what you could be when you're not post alcoholism. Which one you're sacrificing to the other mattered. And for anyone else, they can do this same mental exercise. What version of you are you sacrificing to what other version of you? And that process of death and rebirth, going through those withdrawals, hanging yourself by a tree, you're ending a state of you to begin a new one. And so this shamanic journey doesn't necessarily need to require a literal death that I feel so many pagans think is necessary. And I've heard of Wiccan circles trying to manufacture a symbolic death through a process of, like, we're going to have you do these activities to manufacture the scene of your death. So they pretend to suffocate you to death or whatever else. I heard of this one thing that's kind of unrelated where they do this rebirthing. This is not associated with Wicca.
Yeah. It's a therapy thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, rebirthing therapy. I think it's super weird. Go on.
It's crazy, but they're basically doing the same psychological thing. They are killing a form of you to allow another to be reborn. And
Like they squeeze you, they physically
yeah,
squeeze you and like mimic the contractions and like forcing you through the birth
yeah,
canal and like everything. Yeah.
yeah. And I just find that this shamanic journey is very important, and a lot of people go through this sometimes without even realizing it.
This is the first time like you've used these words now, and it's the first time I'm really conceiving of my ordeal as a shamanic ordeal.
Mhm. But what does it mean as a shamanic ordeal? You're not necessarily, you are, and you're not coming out of this experience reborn with magic, not in the sense of the fantastical,
No,
like, look at me, I can talk to ghosts now. But
it's a spiritual transformation.
yes, and there
It's
is a magic in that, but it's not
yeah.
necessarily what the books hype it up to be. If you go to your local pagan store and look at a book on shamanic journeys and they promise you all of these powers when you complete your initiations, like, no.
That's not it. And the
Yeah.
thing, like, I don't know, I don't like using the word shaman outside of its actual context. But unfortunately, in English, we don't really have any other. We could call it an Odinic journey
We could.
because because Odin did not like. So I think to kind of bring this full circle, like what we've described, we talked about before we started the recording. We were talking about hex signs from the Pennsylvania Dutch culture and ascribing them a magic, but that they are not magical, that someone who's painting them with an intent to bring something into their life may, in doing so, evoke a magical effect. In the same way that the runes themselves are not spells, but that using them in isolation or in words to evoke an effect, that's the magic of them. That's how they could be used in a powerful sense. And in the same way, what Odin didn't just get magical powers. Like he didn't get, at least my interpretation of this is not, now I can point my finger, cast my lightning out of my fingers and like stop the spear from flying. No, it's songs. I learned songs. Songs that will let me, songs that take time to sing. You have to plan to use them. We see this all over the mythology. We'll come to a story where Osiris sings songs over Thor in order to extract a lodestone from his head, um, or a whetstone, and so on and so forth. And so I think that no, when we talk about an Odinic journey, we could very well be talking about this kind of spiritual transformation that this could be the point where, nah, I don't know, I don't want to say that. But that this was he went through a spiritual transformation, right? One where he went in with this great desire for knowledge, maybe in order to be able to cause harm, and walked out with a bunch of songs that don't cause harm. I'm curious, and I know we're almost out of time. I learned 9 spells from the famous son of Bolthor, and I want a drink of that precious mead poured from Odreirir. He doesn't say which spells they are. Right. And this is presumably before, like this stanza 140, right? I began to be fruitful. I became wise. I grew. I thrived. One word chased another word flowing from my mouth. One deed chased another deed flowing from my hands. These stanzas 140 and 141 are almost out of place. He's like, I hung on the tree. Oh, and also I gained knowledge. I drank from the mead of poetry. I learned these spells from Bolthor's son. You will find runes that I painted, whatever, do you know how to write them, whatever, I know magic spells, etc., etc., etc. This is what I learned. And so I wonder why those stanzas about the meat, because the meat of poetry was in his plane, not in this weird plane he was in, hanging on Yggdrasil. Like you would almost, if Yggdrasil itself supports the levels of Asgard, Midgard, and Niflheim, then did he have to depart all three of those planes in order to actually be on the tree? I think so. And so if presumably the Mead and Kvasir were in Asgard or in Jotunheim or wherever they were, then that part of the story is out of place. It was a different event. How is it connected? What's it doing here? I don't know. I'll need to go into the Norse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a choppiness to it.
Yeah.
That is a conversation for another time as we continue to read further. And my last point that I would like to highlight is that in this discussion, thinking about Kevin Crossley-Holland's telling of this story, and our own stories, we can see that there is magic in the mundane, and that our experience of the world and interaction with it is where the magic is. Our changing as people through crisis events or even regular events can be magical. Our effect on the world around us through something as small as writing something down can have a huge impact. And these small magical things might seem in their mundanity to be trivial and irrelevant, but it takes us these huge crises to see them for what they are and come out of an experience with a new, fresh look on the world around us and interactions with it. And that in itself is that shamanic journey, the coming to realize a new way of being and the shedding and leaving behind of that old way that may be more destructive. And I think everybody goes through this to varying extremes. And so when people read this story, I want them to be thinking about their own shamanic or Odinic journeys and what that looks like for them. And I want to also just add an asterisk. You don't need to be visited by Odin to have an experience like this. It's just not necessary.
No.
And if you feel like you have been, that's great, and pursue that experience and try to understand that. But it leaves us with a lot to think about and a lot to complain about in Kevin Crossley-Holland's choppy retelling. I feel because he does reference in his notes which myths he's drawing from. So he points you in the directions of where you can go to continue to build together the bigger picture of what he's sloppily throwing together. So as we're going, we'll reach these myths, and we might want to revisit some of these previous ones, having a greater understanding of what he paints in those later myths, how that influences the earlier ones. And then maybe we can have a second conversation. But
definitely. Yeah. All right. I think that concludes our discussion for the day.
I think it does.
All right.